Hello and welcome to Deal Flow, the show where we keep you informed about the latest merger and acquisition trends. We look into the minds of investment bankers, financiers and CEOs on the buying trail. I'm Erika from Merwe. In this episode, the considerations around intellectual property rights and assets are significant and complex. We get some perspectives from our panel of expert guests, but first, the deals of the week. Media and printing group Caxton said it will sell its 15% stake in Pearson Southern Africa for $68 million to publisher Longman Group. Caxton sold a 35% stake in Pearson to Longman in 2009, but had put and call options on the remainder of its original 50%. Nestlé wants to keep its options open for its stake in cosmetics firm L'Oreal and will not extend a purchase contract with France's Bettencourt family. The Swiss company owns a 29.5% stake in L'Oreal. The expiry of a 10-year right of first refusal agreement with the Bettencourt family in April 2014 would make it easier for Nestlé to sell. Top investors in Vodafone Group are set to clash over what the company should do with perhaps as much as $130 billion in proceeds from the sale of its stake in Verizon Wireless, which is expected to be announced imminently. A company's intellectual property, particularly brands and trademarks, are often its most valuable assets. We're taking a look at what companies in the process of a corporate merger or acquisition needs to do to ensure that relevant IP is properly identified, handled and transferred. In studio with me, Steven Kilfoil, partner in corporate finance at Thornton, and Darren, Olivier, partner at Adams & Adams. Good to have you here. Good to have big minds here on this particularly important issue. So Darren, let me start with you. So there are various issues. Now, because intellectual property is intangible, I would imagine some of the first stumbling blocks could be in identifying what exactly it is we're talking about and also what the value is of these particular assets.
Correct, and I think just on the valuation side, it's an increasing part of a business's overall value is its asset value, intellectual property asset value, and that's typically patents, trademarks, know-how, designs. These form what we call your intellectual capital value, and it's identifying those within a business. And I think it's fair to say that businesses are generally quite poor at recognizing that for themselves. And when it gets to identifying it, we very often get a questionnaire that we send to the businesses come back and say they don't own anything or very little. And I think that's part of the problem.
Stephen, are there often disputes over what exactly that intellectual property is and what it's to be valued at? And are there, for instance, accounting rules that completely delineate how to go about that and to audit that?
Auditing, that's another story. There certainly are. Unfortunately, under South African, in fact, international financial reporting standards, internally generated intellectual property is not placed on the balance sheet of a company. It does take place when there's a merger and acquisition and you account for the acquisition under IFRS 3. Then there is a scope for the acquiring company to value those brands, the trademarks, intellectual property, customer contracts, those types of issues. But it doesn't happen in the ongoing course of a business that doesn't go through a transaction.
So what comes to mind is if you're a business and you're building a business, often business owners are ultimately thinking of an exit. And so if one works with that horizon, if you want to boost your exit value, it's about making sure that you identify that intellectual property at an early stage and value it correctly.
Correct. I mean, let's just take an example of Skype, shall I say. When they went and launched on the stock exchange, they had to identify an opposition, just a general trademark opposition with B-Sky-B. And the reason for that was that it had a fundamental effect on its primary asset, which of course was its name. And it's something that could have been done right at the outset. Before they even started, they could have checked the register to see what else was out there and maybe chosen a different name. For example, obviously it's been successful, but this is the importance of IP, generally speaking, and often overlooked.
What about ownership? I would imagine often there might be disputes over who owns the IP within a corporate.
Absolutely, especially in a tech company where often you get IP that's developed over time. various people get together. I mean, look at Facebook. There's a prime example. Was it the founder or was it his friends that originally came up with the idea, the IP, and who owned it? So, especially because at the beginning stages, people they do things out of the goodness of their heart. Let's get involved. Let's make a plan, and it doesn't get put down in paper, and it doesn't get delineated right at the very beginning who actually owns it.
Yes. So, Steven, what could be some of the weak links in a process? In say, a business is acquiring another. What could be some of the weak links for you as the acquiring company in doing such a deal? Items that you should be looking out for, processes that need to be ticked?
Well, I think the first thing would be a register of what IP actually belongs to the company. We obviously do that in consultation with attorneys, make sure that what the company says it's the registered owner of, it is, that the patents, trademarks are registered with the relevant authorities. That would be the first step, making sure that they have legal title to what they say they do. From our point of view, when we're looking at transactions, we like to look a little bit deeper than necessarily what's just on the register, but also the know-how, how things are done by the company. Those types of issues are important, and that there's a transfer of that knowledge when the transaction takes place.
How long does such a due diligence take?
Oh, it can be a long process. Our standard process is probably about 6 weeks to do a full financial due diligence as well as legal in conjunction with the attorneys. Transactions are expensive. It's obviously important to do the necessary diligence at the outset to avoid problems later.
Yes. Darren, I saw Steven sort of eyeing you when you mentioned the lawyers. So there's also the element of once the due diligence is done and the deal is agreed to, the transfer of the ownership in that intellectual property. So the lawyers come in there too. Yeah,
I mean, they have different rules. Let's say, for example, a trademark, it's a bundle of rights possibly across the world. And if it's a South African company acquiring a company from another territory and they're acquiring the assets, it depends how they've been registered. South Africa is not a member of the Madrid Protocol, for example, which means that they cannot buy an international registration, and you have to structure the deal in a different way. So that's the type of input that a lawyer gives in that transaction, and sometimes it can have effect on the value of the transaction. So what Steven was saying earlier is going a bit deeper, is to say, okay, a patent in South Africa is literally granted as a matter of course. There's no check to see, in fact, how valid it is. So sometimes you need the lawyer to go and do additional searches to see how enforceable that patent is, and that may well have a great effect on the actual value of the transaction.
Yes. Now, sticking with the theme of a cross-jurisdictional deal, if you had the South African patent, the South African IP, and you had, say you're a venture capital business and you have a potential US investor interested in your business, what are the tricky points there and the considerations for you to, again, dress up your business in the best possible way?
Yeah, I think South Africa does itself a disservice by having strict exchange control regulations on that, because it affects the timing of the transaction, not necessarily that it can't take place, but moving IP from South Africa to someone who's non-domiciled requires a specific step. You have to go and get exchange control approval for that. And that sometimes puts risk on the transaction altogether. It can also decrease incentives to invest here locally in IP. So that's one of them. But there are a number of others.
Mm. Steven, would you like to add to that? And what comes to mind is that increasingly, given technology, given the way industries are evolving, it's clear that intellectual property, these intangible assets, are becoming so much more important in the valuation of any business, whether it's not just technology, it's telephony, it's health, it's even in industrial processes.
Well, I think what I would like to add is that any investor is going to want to, so you mentioned the United States investor wanting to take a stake in a South African company, they're going to want to have as much control over that IP as they can, and that would normally mean moving that IP from South Africa to the States so that they can have closer control and they can monitor, the pros and cons, the flow of funds, the revenue generated from that IP. So the problems that were mentioned are exacerbated by our exchange control. You've got to get a fair and reasonable done on the price that is paid. And with the intricacies of valuing IP that we've discussed earlier, that's easier said than done. And someone's got to put their name down and say that that's a fair price. But the valuation methodology, and it's difficult.
Yes, so you've just confirmed there isn't a clear valuation methodology necessarily that we can go to and just get a crispness to this.
Well, valuation methodology obviously varies from place to place and industry to industry. It all comes down to what cash flow can be generated from the transaction. But in a tech company, that's often a how long is a piece of string type argument.
And there's time horizon and when the cash flows start coming in. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
Try and put cash flows to Facebook.
Yes.
It's very, very
still
difficult.
difficult.
It's still difficult.
So your parting comments, if I were to ask you perhaps some lessons learned and perhaps some of the weakest links, what you've seen in businesses building IP, what words of wisdom do you have for them to make sure that they ultimately have the best possible valuation for that business?
I think don't overlook IP. I mean, I think it's important and increasingly important to go and speak to someone who knows, who can help you just identify the IP in the business. It might be more valuable than you think it is, and then document it and record it. Because once that's done, it's easier to value it and easier to transfer it, and you have much more control.
And who does that? Is it a lawyer? Is it an auditing firm or an accounting firm?
Both. I think both can help you. The lawyer obviously is crucial because it's the person who does your legal title. You know, it's like speaking to a conveyancer for a property. You know, it's your legal title to your brand, to your invention, etc.
Yes.
But increasingly, it's different advisors. For example, corporate finance guy, you can involve you in where to spend your budget. Where's the value? Where your value on exit? Where's it going to be? It's no use to you spending thousands of money up around on a patent if actually it's not going to be crucial to the deal.
And Steven, your words of advice in this matter, and then also even for companies wanting to do acquisitions, where the ideal places might be for them to start doing the search.
Okay. The advice I would say for a company would be start early. Make sure that from an early age of your business that all the relevant documentation, title, etc. is in place. It makes the lawyer's job a lot easier later on. From the point of view of advice for a buyer, I would say look for cleanly run companies, look for companies that have a history of doing things properly, good corporate governance, the structures in place to make sure that what they say they're doing, and they're doing it well.
Steven and Darren, thank you very much for your insights, your time, valuable time. My guests were Steven Kilfoil from Grant Thornton and Darren Olivier from Adams & Adams. And that's a wrap of this edition of Deal Flow. We'll see you the same time next week. Goodbye.